So welcome to this episode of the Conscious Shift series for the Legacy Life podcast. I have a fantastic guest I'm really excited about here today. I've got Tessa, who is not only talking to me today, but she's also going to be coming into my community to do a talk about bodies, periods, and sex. So, which are topics that can be really challenging as parents to talk about with our children. So welcome today.
Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you here today. So I thought we'd start off by talking about why do you think parents find it so difficult to approach the topic that we're going to be doing the talk on?
Well, I've been running mother and daughter circles and going into schools to talk about periods and cycle awareness and all sorts of things for a while now. And I think they find it difficult because their parents found it difficult. And so what was modeled to them in the way that a parent communicates around this subject is that it's awkward and it's embarrassing, and so it's changing the story around that is my passion, really. To say from the beginning, just when children start to speak and they start to ask questions about the world, that's when you answer questions one by one, rather than thinking about one day there's going to be the talk, which puts the fear of God into parents.
That's a big shift in mindset, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you said this, actually, because that is a huge shift in mindset, isn't it? And from the talk about periods, the talk about sex, to a more I don't know what to call it, a sort of gradual approach, I suppose.
Yeah, and for some people, they won't even have had a talk. They might have been left a bed on the end, a book on the end of their bed, and they were sort of left alone to digest that information, and probably felt a bit awkward about asking questions because it was just left there, and they got the idea that this is a difficult thing to talk about. So they know that they want to do it differently, but it can be hard to reinvent that process. So that's part of what we do sometimes in the mother and daughter circles, or if we have a mums only circle, is think about, well, what would you have actually have liked? What would have been helpful to you? Also, when people actually, if girls start their period, that can be a really tricky time. They might not feel like they can share that news, or they don't know who to go to, or maybe they don't have the pads or whatever they want to use easily available. And I found when I've run retrospective menarche ceremonies where women look back and they share what actually happened and then what they would have liked to have happened, it's often usually that they would have just loved to tell somebody and be given a hug. It's often that simple. They just wanted that touch and that, yes, it's going to be okay. We'll do this together. We'll figure out what works for you, whether it's pads or cups, or we'll do it together. And it's often not more complicated than just wanting, eye contact. Yeah, you're growing up, and here's a hug.
Yeah, so simple. That is so simple, isn't it? And thank you for sharing your experience around that, because it can be easy to overcomplicate things in life, can't it? And feel like, especially if we've got this worry or this fear about messing it up, or it's if we had not the most supportive experience. I know I didn't really have a very supportive experience around that. So yeah, there can be this worry about getting it right or doing something more helpful, but like you say, not really knowing what that is. And to think that it can be as simple as being there. Do you know, it reminds me, there's a book and a film actually called Being There, and it's so powerful just being there, isn't it? You know, and bringing our presence, bringing our focus, bringing our attention, bringing our love, yeah, is huge.
And there's all sorts of other things that you can do. You know, if you might have a little box of things ready for when, you know, she comes and says that it started, and, you know, it might have I don't know, like a little locket in that they'll keep to remind them of that time, or it might have some period pants or some chocolate, who knows. You know, it might be that you've talked about it with your daughter and you've decided that you'd like to go out for a special tea to mark, you know, so there are extra things that you can do. But I think what you were saying about being there, very often dads can be absent, and it feels like they're not there as part of that experience, whether it's because they think it's girl stuff, or, well, she wouldn't want me to know. I've said to my partner that when it comes to my daughter starting, I'd love him at some point to acknowledge it in his own way. So it might be that if he didn't want to say something directly, it could write a card or a letter. But I think it's so important to have the masculine element acknowledging that rite of passage. I think that's really, really important, and it's often missing.
Yeah.
From, you know, and it also then goes through into things like, you know, do dads start to feel uncomfortable about having their daughter sitting on their lap once they go through puberty? Like they're sort of realizing that their daughter's shifting and they don't quite know how to handle that. But you know, probably I would expect most of the daughters would still love a hug from their dad. And I think it's having those conversations and opening up those things. So very much respecting when she's ready to tell different people. So if my daughter said to me, well, I don't feel quite ready yet to tell dad, I'd be okay, that's fine. Let me know when you are. It's important that we tell him at some point.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
But in various the retrospective menarche ceremonies I've done in the past, people have shared how the news was shared with people that they weren't ready for it to be shared. Such a sense of betrayal, you know, at such a really kind of critical and vulnerable time is it can be very damaging. So, you know, there is a bit of a balance there, but it doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, the talk that we're going to be doing together is, you know, it is about that aspect, but it's, you know, we're going to be really diving into that kind of time and handling those things and people's questions around that. But we'll also be talking about you know, talking about bodies in general, and, you know, yeah, ways in which to do that, but also, you know, about sex as well, you know, which is another big taboo subject, or can be, you know, and awkward subject, you know. So yeah, so it's gonna be a great
Yeah, I'm
session.
looking forward to it. And for me, it all connects into, you know, sort of other work that I do, because I feel like the way we experience our bodies and our ownership over our bodies through puberty sets the scene later on for, you know, as we are cycling, menstrual cycles, you know, can change over time. Maybe at some point decide you want to have children, you start thinking about fertility and pregnancy, and all the way through to perimenopause, menopause. That really experience of how people communicate around your body and how much sort of ownership they give to you rather than making decisions for you, I think really sets the scene for what happens through your whole life cycle. So it's really important, and I still feel like there's not enough in the curriculum. You know, I know it became compulsory that they talk about menstruation in secondary school. That has to be talked about. As far as I understand it, parents aren't allowed to take children out of that conversation around menstruation. But for example, I lent my kits with all the sort of reusable pads and cups and things like that to the teachers at my daughter's primary school, because they still were just showing disposable pads and tampons, those two things.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet for so many people, period pads are really a game changer, you know.
Yeah.
I feel like there's still so much more that could be done at school. And so if a parent is feeling a little bit awkward about how to address that, it might be that the child misses out on really important information that would help them with their journey.
And it's interesting because on here I always ask, what is the change you want to see in the world? And that's, you know, you started to kind of touch on that a little bit here. And you know, it's an interesting one as well, because obviously, you know, when we're talking about periods, then it's very obviously female orientated, because it's for girls and women. And you know, there's, you mentioned a bit earlier about your partner, you know, and his kind of role within that. And yeah, I assume boys get to find out about that stuff when they, as part of reproduction, I assume, or
Yeah, although I mean, in most schools that I've gone in to give talks, it's usually to year six. The boys and girls are still separated.
yeah
That seems to be a standard thing that the teachers want to do, and I can
yeah
understand it to some degree if the boys would, or girls, I don't, would make jokes or disrupt
yeah
the learning. But it's so important, I think, that actually the boys would have chance to have a look at the pads and the cups, and you know. Whether they have a female partner or not in the future, they will have women in their lives, whether it's
yeah
aunties, friends, and just to have a sense of how do you deal with a period?
yeah
If a friend asks you to go to the shop and get some tampons, do you have the first clue what they are and where to look for them? It
it's
just seems,
it's it's
yeah.
interesting. I was watching Malcolm in the Middle the other night. Not Malcolm in the Middle. It was Young Sheldon on Netflix. And in this episode, the daughter had her first, it started her first period on, and when the dad was on the way to taking her to a baseball game that she was playing in. And so, you know, they stopped off at a shop, and, you know, he didn't have a clue what he was doing. And he literally just put one of everything in the baskets. He didn't know what he was doing at all, and took it to the counter. And the woman said, "You don't know what you're doing, do you want some help?" And he said, "Yes, please." And then she helped them, you know, it helped him. But he was just like so uncomfortable and freaking out, you know. So, you know, I suppose it is important for dads as well to be, you know, because they might be the one helping their daughter.
Yeah, and the products available have changed so much recently. So
Yeah
even if they're really au fait with what a partner uses or a female friend of their age, they might not realize that there are period pants of all sorts of shapes, boxes, thongs, you name it. There are all sorts of styles of period pants. There's even sort of swimming costumes with the same design. There are, as well as the menstrual cups, there are now menstrual discs, which are meant to be able to hold more. It's constantly changing, so it might be that they just don't have a clue about the real range. And I find more and more girls are using a combination of things, especially on the heavier days.
yeah
So
yeah
yeah, it's important, I think, that this is addressed, and that's why I started doing the puberty workshops, really, sort of focused around periods and cycle awareness, because I think the mums were feeling like actually the little that came in primary school was a bit too late for some of the children. They were actually starting puberty, maybe starting year 5, and actually the main talk about periods was in year 6.
yeah
So it was too late for their daughters.
yeah So much changes over time, doesn't it? And yeah and so I suppose there's this sense of needing to update, you know, to update our information and update our ways of being around these things, and particularly around this transition, which is, you know, quite a big one, you know. And you know, for anybody listening, you know, we will be talking about this time during the talk, but we will also be talking about you know, how to talk about sex with your, you know, your children, whether they're male or female, and yeah, and your questions around that. So, you know, all of that is welcome. And
the more questions, the better. That's what I really love when I'm doing groups with children, and they ask the best questions.
yeah,
Particularly at primary school, they seem to be fascinated in twin pregnancies. They always ask questions. They're fascinated.
yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your background. Like, you know, so you've mentioned that you know, you do go into schools and you do talks around around you know, around periods, but you also do, yeah, so tell us a bit more about you and your kind of, because I know your experience is quite wide ranging, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, so I got into yoga while I was at university, and quite quickly decided I wanted to train to be a yoga teacher. But then not quite at the same time, but I also was working research. So I did a PhD in medical sociology. I was based in a rheumatology department for many years doing research there. And so I've always been interested in trying to gather evidence about whatever topic I'm sort of interested in. But also just knowing that there are always different ways of approaching things. And then as I had my own children, I've got two girls, I moved away from research and back to the yoga, and I teach pregnancy yoga and mother and baby yoga. I'm very much interested in sort of women's health across the whole lifespan. And I guess it was after my second daughter was born that I really got interested in the menstrual cycle awareness. I'd been charting my own cycle for both of the pregnancies to sort of help conception. And I thought it was incredible, the body, and I just wanted to learn more and more about it. And so then I started training in menstrual cycle awareness and supporting people who have issues with their periods, or are now sort of coming towards perimenopause and menopause, just to really open up the conversation. I mean, fortunately, around menopause, in the media recently, we've had a lot more people talking about it, whether it's Davina McCall with her program or her book. It's been in lots of magazines. But still, I come across so many people who say that they feel there's very few that they can actually talk and have an honest conversation about it. They still sort of hide the symptoms that they're experiencing. So whether it's sort of talking about puberty, or it's thinking about pregnancy and birth, or through to perimenopause, menopause, it's trying to empower people as much as possible, having the information so they can make the decisions that are right for their body. So I think it's all the different experiences I've had over the years, whether it's doing research and knowing how to access the academic articles, or you know, doing group classes through the yoga. I've sort of brought all those skills together. Writing the books you mentioned, I've written a few for women and children, and it's all about how can we have the right language to talk about our bodies, so we can communicate what we want, and we can make decisions that are right for us.
Yeah, thank you for yeah, and that's so interesting, having the language to communicate what is going on, you know, with our bodies is, yeah, is so powerful and empowering. So I always ask people on this on my podcast, which is with this particular series, how do you feel you're contributing to the shift in consciousness when it comes to your the industry that you're connected with?
That's such a big question.
It's massive, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me give you a few examples. Because I think for me it's about being brave. If I had to sum it up in one word, it's being brave.
Yeah.
Because if I take the example of the first children's book that I did, it's aimed at about, well, five years plus. It's talking about girls' bodies having the right names for different parts, including the vulva, knowing the difference between vulva and vagina. I illustrated it, so it has sort of watercolor, quite simple pictures, so people can understand what's what. And before I actually published it, I sort of took it to various mums and dads and sort of to get their feedback, see if there's anything I'd sort of missed out that they thought was important. And they were all very positive. But there was also a feeling of, oh, you're quite brave to do this. You know, to put that kind of book out there where you're talking about vulvas and it's for children. Because I think a lot of people are worried that if you start using those kind of words, that you might sexualize a child. And actually, it's to safeguard them, so they have the right language to, you know, to explain. It might be to a doctor to explain if a part is itchy or whatever it might be.
It's such a good point. The safeguarding point that you're making, you know, coming into to our language. Yeah.
And I think, you know, children are very curious about the world. They can be sensual, you know, they like cuddles, they like stroking cats and dogs, but people sort of confuse that with sexuality. And for me, it's just so important that, you know, age appropriate, that you have an understanding of how your body works, you know.
And that's something that we'll be discussing in our talk as well, is like what is age appropriate, because it can be hard to know, can't it? You know, what is age appropriate. Yeah, so I'm sure that is a topic that we'll be looking at during our talk together, this sense of, yeah, what is age appropriate. And you know, it's interesting, it just made me think about trains when you were talking, and that might seem odd thinking about trains, but you know, when my children were little, I've always kind of had the mindset of using names for things, like a train is a train rather than a choo-choo. You know, it's a train. And I know, you know, I know people use, I don't know, do the choo-choo thing. I always kind of thought of it as, well, then you can't, they're learning two words for something when it's, you know, he's a train, right? And that might be the sound it makes or whatever. But yeah, so I always tended to use the actual words for things. And if, you know, if children say choo-choo because it's come from them, then that's fine. But I wouldn't teach a child, this is a choo-choo, you know, or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think I've always come from that place of using the names for things. Yeah. And yeah. And I think, but when it comes to bodies, like you say, that this whole safeguarding piece comes in for them actually being able to know what things are called. Like I think some adults probably still don't know what their anatomies, the proper names are for their anatomy, you know.
There are plenty of people that get confused with the vagina and vulva.
Yeah.
You know, because commonly the vagina is used around the outside part as well. And yeah, there's a lot of confusion there. But I think, you know, again, this tracks all the way through to the work I do around pregnancy and birth. So, for example, last Sunday I was running a birth preparation workshop, and I had 7 couples, and we were introducing, so how many weeks exactly they were, and where were they planning to have the baby. And I remember one of the ladies said, "Well, I'm planning to have the baby at hospital. It doesn't really matter where in the hospital, does it? Whether it's the midwife-led unit or in the delivery suite." I was like, oh, well, we will be getting to that because it's incredibly important. And I think at the moment, I'm trying to be quite brave when it comes to antenatal education, in the sense that I've decided you really need to start talking about the context, the maternity system in which people are trying to have their babies. It used to be when I started that I would just focus on tools and techniques for during labour. But I feel like that's not really enough anymore, because it can change so much the outcome where you are intending to have the baby. And I feel like there's a lot of paternalism in the system. And so...
What do you mean by paternalism in the system?
Yeah, so I think when you look at how somebody will go through the antenatal appointments and then how they're actually treated during the labour, there's it's very much, there's the expert there who's the health professional, and they've done so many years of medical training, or the midwife has seen how many births, and sometimes what happens then is that the person just sort of gives their agency away and says, well, they're the ones who know what should happen in this situation. And again, I think I always say, just learn as much as you can about the different things that may happen, because then you can have an opinion about them, whether you'd rather go one way or another way. And so again, it comes down to language. Do we have the language to be able to express what we want, what we need? So in terms of children and their bodies, that might be expressing at what point they just want to be in the bathroom, have a shower by themselves without you being there anymore. In birth, it might be saying, actually, I don't want a vaginal examination, or not right now, and saying, maybe in half an hour, ask me again, and feeling confident enough to say what you want, or to ask the question, well, why is it that you want to put the monitor on? What information is that going to give you that's going to change what's happening here?
And it's interesting not being afraid to ask questions, and when I was preparing for my eldest daughter's birth, I went to an NCT style class at like a children's center, and the lady who did it was absolutely brilliant. And as part of those sessions, one of the sort of birth preparation sessions, one of the sessions was we went and visited the hospital. It was brilliant. So she took us around the hospital, she took us to the maternity unit, and she very much went, this is your room. Like, if you want to move the bed to the side, move the bed, like, make it your own, make it your space, so you feel like you have, like, it's your space for that time, rather than that you're, to really make you feel comfortable. And she got us to, like, put the bed where we want it to be, and this kind of thing. And it was so empowering. And you wouldn't think to do that. You wouldn't think of the space in that way. And so it was such a brilliant visit, and so it's so empowering because it's not the midwife space. It's not, I think when you're there, you probably think of it as the health professional space. Like, they're passing through, really, while they're there. It's not their room either, it's a room they're working in. But to be able to kind of feel like, actually, I can move things, and I can have a ball and bounce on it, or do what I need to do, and I can say what I need, yeah, is really huge.
I just think it's so easy to give your power away.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful book, I don't know if you've come across it, called Invisible Women.
No, I
And
haven't actually.
it's taken me quite a while to read it because because it makes me quite angry. Yeah, like each chapter is on a different subject. So there's one chapter that's about seatbelts and how they're actually designed for a man's body.
Yeah.
And then there's
Well,
another.
everything in our world, like if you walk into, my mother-in-law was saying this, we went on holiday and we went to a kitchen and the cupboards are so high. We're both not very tall women, right? I'm 5'2", she's about 5 foot. And it's like the majority of kitchens have women cooking in them. And, this kitchen we were in, we couldn't reach most of the staff, right? And it's just like, because it's designed by a man for men, and often in this, who aren't actually even going to be using the kitchen, like the man in the house barely used it. So, you know, crazy. But the whole world is like that, even toilets, with positioning of mirrors, like, anyway, sorry, I went off on a rant there for a moment.
Yeah, no, but
But
yeah,
it's like everything.
there are so many examples in that book, including one that I was already familiar with, which was to do with pharmacological research, because very often they do the trials with men because they don't have the fluctuating hormones, and that can complicate the whole picture. So then you end up in a situation where you're prescribing drugs for a particular condition where the trials have been done on men, but you're prescribing them to women,
Yeah.
so it comes through to really serious things. And so whether it's putting your foot down when it comes to birth and saying, well, actually I feel like I'd like to try to be at home, and being supported in that decision. Or maybe later on,
And being brave, like, how many times you get told how brave you are when you're making that choice, right?
Yeah, or later on, say somebody's having menopausal symptoms, and I think it's something like one in 3 women are offered antidepressants instead of medication that's directly going to affect the hormones that are causing the symptoms. So it's, I think what I'm always trying to do is look for the information that's going to be helpful, that people can really understand what impact something's going to have on them. And another good example is the pill. There's a great book written by Jane Bennett and Alexandra Pope called The Pill. It's probably a little bit outdated now, but the principles that they talk about in there are still very much relevant. And I just hear a lot of mums saying that their teenage daughters are having issues with bad skin problems or heavy periods, and the default thing is the GP wants to put them on the pill.
Yeah.
But that's going to sort of mask what's going on rather than really get to the underlying causes. And have they gone through the impact long term of being on the pill? Or if they're incredibly sporty, it can have an effect on their bone health, quite quickly. So these are important things that just get glossed over. But 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the line actually is something that we might have to live with the consequences of.
Yeah. So being informed, is so important. And that book that you mentioned, Invisible Women, sounds really interesting, and it sounds like I will probably end up being just really annoyed reading if I read it.
Everybody I know who's been reading it has said they've sort of read a chapter and then they had to put it down for a while.
Yeah, I think I would probably be like that, because I'd be like, because you kind of know this stuff, or you don't know this stuff, or you have an awareness of it, and it is, it's so unfair actually, and it's so and it comes back to this living in a patriarchal society where things are so male focused actually in so many ways, and it's you know, I suppose when you start to look into it, it's so pervasive in all of life, which can feel a bit rubbish, really, can't it?
There's another really good book that just came into my mind, which is called Roar, like a lion roaring, Roar.
Mhm.
And it's written by a lady who does a lot of work around training. So,
Mhm.
you know, physical activity and how that intersects with the menstrual cycle. And she's always saying in her podcast, in the book, women are not small men.
Yes.
Women are not small men. They're different. They're not just
Yeah.
smaller. And um, you know, for me, this is so important that we begin to understand, you know, let's take physical exercise as an example, that if you're having a natural cycle and you're not on something like the pill, then yes, you are going to feel different at different parts of the month. And
Yeah.
perhaps how you go about your training, or how about you go, you know, a project at work, that sometimes you might be more willing to be standing up and doing a presentation to lots of people. Other times that's not going to feel so enticing, and you're going to be more interested in maybe doing the detail and the background work. And I think when we begin to realize that we're not the same all the time,
Mm.
such a kindness to ourselves,
Yeah.
so much
Yeah, because
compassion.
yeah, it's completely that sense of compassion, because otherwise I think we can end up beating ourselves up that we're not performing at the same level all the time. And it's just like, well, nobody does. And yeah, and we're not supposed to be the same all the time. We're cyclical beings, and no human is the same all the time anyway. I think one of my questions that I hadn't asked you is what are some of the myths? And I think that you can be kind of I don't know, that you should be at some kind of optimum level of operating all the time as a human being, and it's just not how humans are, actually.
Yeah, I would say one of the myths gosh, this is a big statement, but in medicine, I think still there's this sort of pervasive notion that women's bodies are, you could say, like faulty or just more complicated than men's, or a bit of a hassle.
Mm.
Because then that tracks through to all the, the issues that somebody might have in puberty, with pregnancy and birth, or through to menopause, all those different life stages that we've been talking about.
Mm.
um, and it can end up with women feeling then that, yeah, that it feels unfair that I've got this body that has to go through so much more. Or actually, we can begin to reframe it and say, if we accept the fact that we are cyclical beings and we will be different at different times, and actually we can begin to tune in and know ourselves and harness the benefits of that particular part, it can be really enriching, and it can
Yeah.
help our creativity.
Mhm.
um, I certainly know for myself, I'm sort of heading into perimenopause now. I used to have a very regular cycle. Now it's beginning to get a bit shorter, but I used to have very distinct phases where, yeah, you get that sort of estrogen high where you feel like, yeah, I can do anything. Yes, 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 saying yes too much, probably.
Yes. Yeah.
And you move a bit further on and you get more into that time where sometimes people get PMT and things. And I sometimes talk about the truth speaker comes out there. So it can come out in a very sort of irritable way with your loved ones, where you can't hold on to the truth anymore. And you're like, rah, rah, rah. But also sometimes there is a grain of truth with what's there, and you just have to wait a little and find a kinder voice to communicate it to other people. But it's
Mhm.
also a time of the phase where um, you do have that discernment, and you can really focus in on say a project where, looking at the nitty-gritty of something, the detail, it really lends itself to that.
It's so interesting because, I was saying just before we came on this call, I just started my period just before we started this call. And yesterday, what you're saying about this discernment, like, yesterday I had this sense of feeling overwhelmed. I was like, and that often happens to me like the day before or 2 days before, that actually I have less capacity for extra stuff. And there was this project that needed this and this, that I'm not being paid for or anything. It's like a voluntary thing. And I was just like, I don't have space. I just don't have space for it. So it does bring some discernment. It's like, I don't have the capacity to say yes right now when I should be saying no, you know? So I just went, no, that's it. I don't have space for this. When another time in the month, I would have probably done it and, maybe resented it a bit or had, overstretched myself. But it makes, kind of, I suppose it makes me go, actually, I've got to pull my energy in because there's only so much I can do right now. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I used to do a listening partnership with somebody around the menstrual cycle, and so we'd meet every Tuesday. We'd have a phone call and just talk about what was happening in our cycle. And when you check in with somebody that regularly, I could know where she was in her cycle depending on how she was talking. She would slow right down, and you could hear her sort of really reflecting on things before she talked during her period. Whereas sort of around ovulation, she'd be very chatty and 100 miles an hour. And, and I think this is one of the lovely things that we can share as people go through puberty is, pay attention to your unique expression of all of this, because there are patterns across people. But when I started doing cycle awareness in my 30s, I just thought, oh wow, actually so much makes sense, because I knew where in the cycle something might happen, and that gave me a lot of sort of acceptance of myself. Whereas if I just thought it was happening randomly, I might think, oh gosh, this is hard to manage, or so it might be emotions that come at a particular time of the cycle. It might be behaviors, it might be particular symptoms. There's different levels that you can do it on, but we're all a bit different. And what I'm finding as I go into perimenopause is that it's shifting again. And whereas the difficult part in my cycle might have been sort of just post ovulation, that was kind of, if I had been saying yes too much, I'd suddenly crash and go, oh no, what have I done? Whereas now it's shifted to, as I come out of the period into pre-ovulation, that's my tricky point. I have to really be tender with myself, because that's where I, at the moment, can feel a little bit of anxiety creeping in. But because I know that it always happens at that point, and I know it will pass in a couple of days, it really helps me to manage it. But without paying attention to what my unique cycle looks like, I would have no idea. And I might be worried and rushing to the GP, or I don't know what, trying to fix things.
Yes, it's know thyself, huh? It is that, isn't it? So what do you think people will get out of coming to a discussion with us about bodies, periods, and sex?
I would hope that they will just feel a lot more confident in answering their children's questions. Because I think people are often worried about getting it wrong, but I think when they come to the talk and they hear about different resources that they can use, or different approaches, they'll just give it a go. And that's the most important thing. And sometimes people might make a mistake, and just you can come back and say, I didn't answer that very well, like let's have another try. But the main thing is feeling confident to keep those communication channels open. That would be my big hope.
That's huge, isn't it? That I think that is huge. That confidence, and like you say, keeping those communication channels open is a big one. So I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. So anybody who's listening to this podcast episode, you can tap into that, whether you're listening to this in in November 2022 or later on, so there will be details below this episode where you can tap into that discussion if that's something that you want to do and you want to be part of, whether it's the live one or the recording. So
yeah, you can really change the story for your family.
Yeah. Wow. That's so huge.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tessa. I feel that feels like a really great place to leave this episode. Yeah, you can really change the story for your family, you know, and it's so, I love that, because that's what my Legacy Life podcast is about. That's the work that I do is all about. It's about, being able to change the story, being able to consciously create the story, in the way that you choose to have choice around that. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.